Hey everyone, my name is Anshuman and I'm a solutions architect at Augment Code. I'm joined by my peer Rob Kitaoka, and he'll be answering questions along the presentation. I'm very excited to share with you today what we have been diligently working on to deliver here at Augment. I'll be showing you our product with a live demo, along with time for some Q&A afterwards. Now today we're going to have three distinct demos prepared for you all in three distinct code bases. We're going to begin by using Augment's very own monorepo to show how developers can get up to speed and running on complex code bases with ease. We'll then transition into a download of the box.com SDK and using Augment's help, write new functionality and unit tests within minutes. Finally, we're going to visit the server-side logic of a full-stack app to refactor the code in lightning-fast speed using Augment. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take some time to discuss why we believe context is everything. Augment's biggest differentiator is how it deeply understands your code base. So let's talk a little bit more about that in regards to software development. Now, when people think about software development, they think it's just coding. But software development is not just about writing code. It's about thinking and changing software. The issue is we're almost always working on unfamiliar code. That's the truth about software developers, especially those working on larger teams of 20 or 70 devs or more. I find myself always implementing new libraries, working on someone else's code, or even working on my own code from 6 months ago. What this means is that before I can even begin writing a single character, I need to review and plan for things like dependencies, edge cases, data flows, patterns, readmes. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And as companies grow in size and complexity, so do their code bases. But complex systems are hard to get into your head, and this leads to an inverse relationship between code complexity and the developer experience. The reasons I just mentioned are why enterprise-level AI for code is an unsolved problem. Knowledge silos are increasingly getting larger as code bases become more complex. Documentation is outdated, and tribal knowledge starts permeating multiple teams. That's why context awareness is the key to everything in the AI for code space. Augment has mastered the art of retrieving the most relevant pieces of information for each request in large code bases. Imagine how much better your suggestions and completions are when they're relevant to your code base and the context within it. With Augment, you're going to get to realize the difference between a generic suggestion and one from a principal engineer on your team. This then translates into real-world solutions for both leaders and developers in things like modernizing legacy apps and reducing onboarding time. Let's take a look at Augment Code in action with the live demo. So for the demo today, I'm going to be going through, again, three distinct code bases to show how Augment integrates with the developer throughout the entire workflow to enhance the dev experience. Now, the first phase of the workflow is going to be information discovery and then planning. Before we can begin changing the code, developers need to understand the inner workings of the structure and functionality. Then we need to parse documentation and develop a game plan to ensure that consistency and best practices are present throughout the code base. So I'm shifting over to my IDE of choice, VS Code here. We support VS Code and JetBrains IDEs, and it's a simple extension. And after I authenticate, Augment's going to index the entire workspace by default. As you can see, I don't have to choose a certain model. I don't have to open certain files because the way we built our open source and in-house combination of models, we want to give developers the ease of access with less friction so they can begin coding as quickly as possible. Now, I have the Augment monorepo open here, and we're a big believer of drinking our own champagne, so we actually use Augment to create Augment. Now, this monorepo has thousands of files and millions of lines of code. So whether I'm a 10x dev who's been working here all the time, or I'm new to the project or the company as a whole, I always have to surface pivotal information, which is where context comes into place. Now, because Augment's already aware of the entire workspace, I can begin by asking questions such as, what API routes are present in this code base? And Augment's going to be able to walk through the entire code base and provide a response, which is going to save me hours or days or even weeks, depending on how complex the code base is. It's going to give a nice structure and define the functionality of everything that I asked for. Now, Augment is multi-turn, so I can actually add upon previous responses. For example, how do I add a post route to 4? Augment's going to know that I'm talking about the runner service, and it's going to output code that's not generic, but actually matches the style, structure, and syntax of my entire code base. I can then copy relevant piece of code, or I can actually use our smart apply functionality to get a nice little diff view and apply those changes in my code. We also understand that you may not be working on just a single repository, or you might have libraries or multi-repos that interact with each other. The way we enable you to enhance the context at Augment is actually by adding additional files, such as code files or documentation, to enhance Augment's context. For this example, I'm going to be adding a documentation of architectural decision records, which basically reviews technology choices and the reasoning behind it. This kind of goes into the planning stage of the developer workflow. Before I can start making changes, I need to first make sure the right teams are notified or the right technology is used. Instead of going through all of that process, I can just upload the relevant documentation to Augment and start asking questions, such as, according to ADRs, is Tailwinds an approved CSS framework? Augment's going to be able to grok that documentation for me and provide the response within seconds. Now, we also understand that you want to maybe focus the context in certain areas. So we give the ability for you to specify certain files or folders for Augment to use in its responses. We also understand that languages, frameworks, they all change through the times with different versioning. So syntax, functionality, they can be vastly different depending on the version. Instead of you having to spend hours on Stack Overflow or outdated sites, we've already pre-uploaded over 300 external docs for you to use. So for this example, if I wanted to start coding in Tailwind and I found my specific version, any follow-up question I ask Augment, Augment's going to then look at the documentation and provide the response adhering to the instructions in that documentation for me. Now, another pivotal piece of the information discovery and planning stage is if I'm, for example, tasked with adding an attribute to a certain data structure. First, I have to find that data structure, and for whatever reason, maybe I can't remember the name. I know it's related to edits, but if I search that, I have over 20,000 results, and none of them point me in the right direction. Maybe I remember that it's related to edit events. I now have over 30 results, but again, none of them are pointing me to where I need to be. With Augment, we have the ability to ask questions in natural language the same way you would ask a senior or 10x dev in your team. For example, where is the data structure for full exported edit events? And because Augment understands how the code actually functions, it's able to point me to the exact file and the exact data structure edit datum that I was looking for. I can then go and begin my task. And Augment is going to autocomplete my thought for me, and it's going to follow the syntax, for example, a doc string after every attribute. Now, we understand that the task is only going to be 1 or 2 lines of code changes in one file. It's going to be rippling through multiple files with multiple edits needed. And Augment's here to help you for the entire feature at hand, not just 1 or 2 lines of change. So with an upcoming feature called Suggested Edits, Augment's going to take me through line by line on different files to make appropriate updates that are caused by this ripple effect from one change. If I don't want to go through with singular edits, I can actually look at suggestions at a global level. So Augment over here is realizing that there's a Git diff of adding the session ID to that datum field, and it's going to go through all the files in my workspace and give me the appropriate changes needed. Now, because Augment takes into context things like where your cursor's at, what files are open, what docs have been highlighted, it also takes in what's called recency information. So it knows that what I'm doing right now is of the utmost importance. So if I accept or if I even reject, Augment's going to understand my intent better and update its suggestions accordingly. Now that we talked about information discovery and planning, let's talk about the next phase, which is the actual writing and testing of code. This usually takes the bulk of the dev cycle, and code quality and context awareness are key here to ensure optimal time to ship. This also includes refactoring, one of the crucial aspects of maintaining a code base's readability and functionality while improving its design and structure. So I'm going to go in and shift gears and open up the download of the box.com SDK. Now, say I'm tasked with creating a folders functionality. I've started off with my imports, and let's see how Augment can help expedite the task at hand. So Augment's automatically going to give me suggestions, and then within less than 200-300 milliseconds, it's giving me the following suggestions that are matching the structure and functionality of the rest of my code base, as I mentioned before. If I don't like the suggestion, I can actually just go in and start typing over it. And again, Augment's going to update the following code because it understands my intent. Let's go in and add a delete. And as you can see, in under a minute, I've created this folders functionality, just tabbing through the auto completions provided by Augment. Now, after I create new code, the next phase is writing unit tests. There's a few ways we go about this using Augment. For example, I can select certain snippets of code, and that's going to update Augment's immediate context. I can combine it with action commands, such as write test. Again, Augment will output the relevant code for me, matching both the structures of the rest of the tests, and I can create a new file or copy it over. Maybe I want to write it from scratch. So let's go in and add my folders.test.js file and begin typing. Now, I also want to point out that all these imports, they're not hallucinated. Augment's actually taking the right suggestions and the right import and file paths. Again, I'll tab through, and in under a second, I've created all the unit tests necessary for the methods I just created. Now, maybe I don't want to write from scratch. Maybe I want to update a current test file. So let's say I want to add a test. To grab a certain specific file. I can begin writing it out. And just from the comment that I added, Augment creates the rest of the unit test for me. So that's a quick example of how Augment's really powerful in terms of writing new functionality and writing tests or even updating files and tests. Let's shift gears one last time and let's pull up a full stack app that I created using Augment. Now the front end is using Angular and TypeScript, and the back end is a Node Express server. Now, in terms of refactoring, I want to pull out my server code. And as you can see, I'm making a lot of calls using console log, which really isn't best practices, and it doesn't give me reusable code that my developers after me can use in different components. So I ask Augment to abstract a logging utility, and I tell it to follow MongoDB's logging structure, which it's going to be aware of. So first, it tells me to create a logger utility, create severity levels, log components, and the logger constructor following MongoDB's setup. I can simply use the create functionality, and Augment's actually going to place this in the new directory utils, which it creates for me in the appropriate section. After Augment tells me to create the utility, it tells me how to update the new code into the server file. Using the smart apply functionality, Augment's going to create this nice little diff view, which I can accept in chunks, or I can accept all the changes, and I'm back in my server code. And in less than 30 seconds, I've refactored it accordingly. Another quick way to make changes using Augment is by using what's called code instructions. Now, maybe I don't want to use chat, maybe I don't want to use auto completions. What we provide the ability to do is select certain lines of code, and with a simple keystroke of Command-I or Control-I, Augment's going to open up a diff view with this command box where I can insert specific directions. So for this use case, maybe I'm going to say update to disallow users with prefix contractors, because I don't want contractors to have access to this route. And for the fun of it, let's add a helper method to get usernames. Within seconds, Augment's going to generate the changes for me. And once I review, I can accept one at a time or accept them all. I'm back in my code file, and I'm good to go with all the changes. So as you've seen, in a matter of minutes, I've not only refactored and abstracted a long utility that can be reused, I can also go in and direct specific changes, and Augment's going to update the code for me and enhance my functionality, readability, and optimize as well. Now, the last phase I want to speak about that really becomes overlooked, but is extremely crucial when working with teams, is documentation and collaboration. We enable that a few ways here at Augment. The first being, we're going to release a functionality for you to be able to create a web instance of your chat history. So instead of you having to copy and paste certain responses or give generic descriptions, I can create a web instance that's accessible only by my team. Here, the team can see what questions I asked Augment, the logic flow, and they can even go in and copy the relevant code to be used in their own workspace. This is going to persist as living documentation for your team to use Augment's logic flow and the code that's necessary. Next is we provide an integration with Slack using the Augment Slack bot. This is extremely useful for technical conversations where maybe you're doing troubleshooting or maybe you have a failed deployment and you're going to have talks with your remote work, talks for having relevancy. But with Augment, you can actually just ask questions to Augment that has access to your GitHub repositories, and it's going to provide specific recommendations and specific points to code. The example I shared here, if you remember, is the same question I asked in our IDE, which is asking for the data structure for full exported edit events. Augment has the same feature parity as you would get through chat in the IDE, and again, points me to the right code file and the right data structure. I can then have teammates come in and follow up on responses and use that multi-turn functionality to have a long-winded conversation with technical specifics. We've actually seen a lot of value from non-dev, non-technical users as well. For example, a PM has the option to create a new button on their website. Instead of waiting for a response from their offshore team or having a 2-hour planning session, they can simply ask Augment what parts of the code need to be changed. And now they have the specifics and they can create a story and assign it to the appropriate developers. So as we're wrapping up the demo portion, I just want to recap some of the features we saw, right? With chat, we were able to do information discovery and planning. With completions, we were able to blaze through writing our code with automated suggestions and write unit tests as well. Suggested edits show you how we can anticipate the ripples of changes from 1 or 2 lines of code to help you go through multiple repositories, multiple files, and multiple languages. We saw how instructions gives you the ability to give directed commands for specific changes. And lastly, we saw how we can enable collaboration with specific technical details using our Slack integration. As we move to the Q&A portion of the session today, I just want to highlight a few resources. For teams that are interested in a more detailed review, please request your free trial at the initial link. We have an upcoming webinar in January where we're going to be pairing up with a C-suite member of one of our customers, and they're going to be talking about how they use Augment to onboard their developers. And lastly, something I'm very proud of is Augment is now free for open source devs because we believe in the open source community. And if you're an open source developer and want to use Augment, please use the last link to start beginning to use Augment for free.
Great. We really actually have a large number of questions. We have a couple that we also received before. One question that we get a lot of questions around is, what about privacy and security?
That's a great question. So I like to point out that we never train on our customers' proprietary code. We never train on any of your data. Every customer will have their own private secure tenant. There's no extractable path. We also have SOC 2 Type 2 attestation, and we're built from the ground up with security in mind. We don't want to train on your code. We don't want to have any data leakage, and we have no potential leakage with the way our architecture and infrastructure is set up. So we guarantee the hygiene of the code and the security of your code as well.
Great. Another question that we've gotten a couple times is currently we use GitHub Copilot. Can you highlight the differences, pros and cons of your product versus Copilot?
Yeah, so GitHub Copilot was the initial wave of AI for code, right? The difference with Augment is, again, that contextual awareness, the RAG architecture we built up. And for 2 years, we've had the brightest minds in AI research come see what the problem is with the current tools and build out Augment to not only meet developers where they're at, but help them from the contextual awareness of the entire workspace. What that means is the suggestions are better, the completions are better. And the way the RAG architecture is set up, it's not going to be a wrapper for open source models. It's trained and optimized to be the best in whatever situation you're using. So our code completions are set up in a certain way, our chat set up in a certain way, and those are some of the key differentiators. And we hear from our customers all the time. The suggestions are just completely better and faster because of that deep contextual awareness.
Great. Another question that we received is what type of customers or teams are the best fit for Augment?
Great question. So we are really built for teams. So Augment's a great fit for teams that are larger than 20 developers who deal with large, complex code bases. But honestly, Augment works well across the board, especially for those that have a mix of modern and less modern languages, and or large monolithic code bases or heavy use of system languages too. And our current customer base reflects that. We have newer companies that are using Augment. We have large monolithic companies that are using Augment.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Question around the Slack piece. How do you configure the context for the Slack instance? Can I have different contexts for different channels?
Great question. Yes. So we currently support integrations with GitHub.com and GitHub Enterprise Cloud. And that's correct. In certain channels, you're going to have to be able to specify which repos Augment's going to be using for context in that channel.
Great. Another question, is it able to identify all the linked dependencies for a specific file and pull those into context too?
Yeah, so there's a bit of background on that, right? So if those libraries or dependencies are inside of your package lock or you have it in your node modules, Augment's going to be aware of that completely. The other side is maybe you're using external libraries that are not present in your workspace. Augment's still going to be able to see how those libraries are used or imports are used in the rest of the code base. And because of its contextual awareness and the RAG model, it's going to be able to draw from that context and use the right imports in whatever file you're using as well.
Okay, great. A couple of questions around through here, and that is, can you explain the pricing structure, including the typical use case?
Yeah, so one thing our customers love is we're a consumption-based model. So you're going to get a pool of credits, and at the end of every month, depending on how many developers actively used Augment, which means they actively accepted a completion or accepted a chat, that's going to draw down from the pool of credits. So say 3 developers are using Augment, and it doesn't matter. There's no cap either, whether it's 1 completion or 1,000 completions. That's going to be 3 credits. The following month, if 2 of the same developers and 2 new developers use it, that's going to be 4 credits. We're not going to count you for developers that are not using it. We're not going to have named seats. It's a pure consumption-based model.
Great. Another question that I have is, I'm a solo or on a small team. Can I try Augment still?
Yeah, Augment is for teams, but if you maintain or contribute to an open source project, we want to support open source, and that is free. So augmentcode.com/open source, you can sign up for free and begin using Augment today.
Okay, great. We still have a lot of questions coming in. Let's see here. Do you have a roadmap where you can share with the features and functionality that are coming in the future?
Great question. Yeah, feel free to contact our sales team from our website, and we're more than happy to have a one-on-one chat and talk about new features and give a more in-depth talk about how Augment can be used specifically for your code bases. Now I'm getting the signal here. Thank you for your time. That's all the time we have today. My name is Anshuman. My email is anshuman@augmentcode.com. Please feel free to reach out afterwards with any follow-up questions or if you and your team would like to have a detailed meeting. But thank you again for your time. I hope you found it valuable, and we're looking forward to talking to you more about Augment.